Folks, I think we're going to start the program now. People will be coming in, I'm sure, as it goes on here. But we're respectful of your time and want to get going. Just one procedural thing, that we will have a Q&A after everyone has given some opening remarks. But if you have questions, please come up to the microphone in front. We have these lights shining at us, and we don't necessarily see you, so don't just raise your hand from the back row because we might not see that. Anyway, welcome to our session here on the elections and criminal justice. I'm Ted Guest. I'm the president of Criminal Justice Journalists. We're a national group. We do a daily news digest called Crime and Justice News that you're welcome to subscribe to, which is free, a daily news digest. See me if you want more information about that. This program is unlike most other programs at ASC. I'm sure if you're members, you know that we have to propose these things about 6 months in advance. Well, 6 months ago, we didn't know what was going to be happening today. Most people at this convention knew 6 months ago what they were going to speak about. Unless our panelists were omniscient, I don't think they knew that. 6 months ago, Joe Biden was running for president, re-election, and Donald Trump was on trial in New York City. That's what was going on. And here we are 9 days after the election. So keep in mind that we didn't know when we planned this what the situation was going to be. And there's still a lot of things we don't know. We're going to do our best to give you our informed speculation and commentary. But again, keep in mind that there's things that haven't been decided. We know who the president-elect is. We know, I think we know now that Republicans are definitely going to control both houses of Congress, but only by very small margins. And I think we know most of the state results. We are going to collectively talk not only about federal issues, but about things going on in the states and localities as much as we know about them. So let's keep that in mind too, that it's not only a presidential issue. However, two things we didn't know until yesterday or until an hour ago, namely who the president-elect was going to name to head the Justice Department. We now know that, but that's sort of hot news. The Congressman Matt Gaetz from Florida, and just in the last hour, the president named Todd Blanche, who is his counsel in his criminal trial in New York, to be the Deputy Attorney General. And our panelists can all attest to the fact that that's a very key position, overseeing much of the Justice Department, including the parts that a lot of us are particularly interested in, the Office of Justice Programs. I'm going to make a couple of opening remarks, and then we're going to have each of the other four panelists here speak for 10 or 15 minutes apiece, and then we will open it up for questions, so we should have time for that. One thing I want to note at the outset, originally in the ASC program, Nancy Levine, the head of the National Institute of Justice, was going to be on this panel, but she's unable to be on this panel, so unfortunately she won't be here, but we have four other distinguished panelists, so we will have plenty to talk about. It's difficult to give an overall impression right now, for me at least, about what happened in all of the elections regarding criminal justice. In my news digest this week, I used a story from the conservative think tank, the Manhattan Institute, which had a headline that this was the so-called anti-crime election. I don't know if I would agree with that. He cited primarily things happening right here in California, which some of our panelists are going to discuss the passage of this proposition that partially rolled back an earlier proposition and was seen as a major anti-crime proposition. And he also cited the defeat of two so-called progressive prosecutors, both in Los Angeles County and in Oakland. And with that and a few other elections around the country, decided that this was an anti-crime election. I don't know that I agreed with that, but it's a topic we all should consider and address today. As far as the president is concerned, again, I'm deferring to the panelists for more detail on this. I don't think we have a lot of detailed information about what he actually is going to do. The two issues that seem fairly obvious to me are capital punishment, which he favors, although we all know that there aren't very many federal capital punishment cases in any case, and the other issue being immigration and deportation. Again, we know where he stands on that, and we probably will discuss that during the panel here, but I don't think we know a lot of details about how that is going to work. And on a lot of other issues, we may draw a blank about what actually is going to happen, again, in the areas that most of us in the room are concerned with. One other point I'll make before turning it over to Lori Robinson. I think we have some signals about what might happen federally based on what some of the Republicans who have been in power in the House already have said. And I noticed, I'm sure you all know, that each House prepares its own appropriations bill saying what the federal government can spend, but typically these things aren't actually enacted because they're seemingly endless continuing resolutions. So what I'm going to read to you here is not something that is in law, but it's something that the Republicans in the House voted this year that they wanted to do. And this is just a quote from this. The Republicans said their bill that they voted for would eliminate progressive grant programs that support criminal leniency. Now, we can speculate what that means. People have speculated it means the many millions of dollars that the Biden administration has spent on community anti-violence initiatives. But I think that's a signal about the kind of thing we're going to be hearing about from Congress in the next couple of years. So the way we're going to do this here, I'm not going to read bios of all of the distinguished panelists. They can mention any of their experience that they want to that's relevant. Lori Robinson is the former Assistant Attorney General in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, heading the Office of Justice Programs, and I think most or all of you know that that office oversees some of the areas you're concerned about, such as the National Institute of Justice and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. The next speaker, Ron Davis, is the head of the U.S. Marshal Service and was actually a law enforcement official here in California. So if he cares to, he can tell you what he thinks about the California votes that I alluded to. Then we have Mark Levin, who's currently from the Council of Criminal Justice, a major think tank a lot of us are familiar with, but were you the founder or the co-founder of Right on Crime? Right on Crime. So he's essentially, although we all can discuss this, I've asked Mark specifically to anticipate what conservatives will want to do as they will be dominating the federal government. And last but not least, Marissa Lagos is a reporter for KQED, which is the public radio station here in San Francisco, and she has covered many criminal justice issues over the years. This is something we won't be able to benefit from, but when I invited her, she made a comment, I think, that she had been covering Kamala Harris for 20 years, which would have been advantageous if the election had turned out another way, but and she can still discuss Kamala Harris if she wants to, but she also obviously is from California and can weigh in on these issues. So again, each of the panelists will speak for 10 or a few more minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. But remember, for you people who just came in, anyone who wants a question, so we all can actually see you and hear you, should come up to the microphone in the center of the front of the room. So we will now go to Lori Robinson.
Thank you so much, Ted. I'm really delighted to be here and part of a panel with a number of longtime colleagues here. In my time, I'd like to address two areas. First, a brief observation about how to interpret in this arena the election results. And second, what I think Trump's victory likely portends for the Justice Department, and specifically, as Ted pointed to, the Office of Justice Programs, the grants and science agencies there, which include NIJ, BJS, BJA, the Juvenile Justice Office, and the Office for Victims of Crime, and also the Violence Against Women Office and the COPS Office. And just for a moment of background, I'm a Washington native, and my father was a Capitol Hill lobbyist, so I grew up with political discussions around the dinner table every night. And I also, as Ted mentioned, I was assistant AG for OJP in both the Clinton and Obama administrations. And after the announcement about the incoming AG, I have to say that I pondered and thought about the fact that I was very, very lucky to have had the opportunity to work for and work closely with two pretty wonderful leaders in Janet Reno and Eric Holder. So as to my first point, with every commentator around the country, it seems, assessing the results of the election, which, if you can believe it, was only a week and 2 days ago. It seems like many lifetimes ago. There has not surprisingly been lots of focus on the Democratic Party's loss as it relates to the economy and immigration, but very little said about crime contributing to the loss. Particularly, I think, because the recent FBI figures for the year had showed violent crime reductions. But I think a key point is missed here. As Leonard Sipes, who's a longtime crime reporter and columnist, wrote last week, the FBI figures don't reflect the fact, and many of you know this, that the National Crime Victimization Survey for the last 2 years had shown large violent crime increases. And equally important, as Washington Post columnist Megan McArdle wrote in August, while homicides are down, and she wrote, quote, "Voters are worried about the air of lawlessness that pervades a lot of public spaces," close quote. And my sense is that the Democrats, to their peril, have ignored public unease with random violence and disorder since the pandemic, and that this has really caused a real issue of divide. During the campaign, the Democrats really didn't address this issue or tell people how they would work on keeping them safe and helping them feel safe. By contrast, I think back to the fact that when I worked on both the Obama and Biden campaigns, a key assignment some of us got, and I worked on this with Eric Holder in both campaigns, a key assignment was reaching out to police chiefs and other law enforcement leaders to line up endorsements. We saw the importance of support from those figures and how key it was to address issues of crime, safety, and justice. So my own view is that if the Democratic Party is interested in reconnecting with average Americans, with the working class, as has been oft discussed in the last 9 days, I'd suggest that addressing public safety explicitly has got to be on the agenda. And in my view, that can be done without abandoning the goal of a just and fair criminal justice system. So let me turn now to my second topic, which is really looking much more specifically at the impact of the election on the Department of Justice in the grants and science area. We have some better sense, certainly, of what Trump's goals are with the two recent announcements that Ted pointed to. But we also will learn more as we hear about the Trump transition work for the Justice Department, because the transition teams do have tremendous influence on what that administration will do, first of all, broadly in criminal justice, and then, of course, who the political appointees will be beyond, for example, the two that have so far been named. I had what I viewed as a wonderful opportunity to serve on the transition teams for both the Clinton and the Obama administrations. It was a great experience, and really saw the kind of influence that those teams can have on who the appointees end up being in the different positions, like directors of NIJ and BJS. For the Obama team, for example, they asked me to come up with proposed appointees for all of the OJP positions, which I did after consulting people in the field. And happily, many of those were accepted by the White House. So a key question after the inauguration is how fast will changes actually occur in the agencies? And the answer is some very rapidly. Ordinarily, before any senior people get their clearances or confirmations, a new administration will send in one or more kind of political handlers. At OJP, for example, they review any pending funding solicitations or requests or other kind of agency plans, move some of them forward, put others on hold until the senior leadership comes in. That's the kind of thing that I did for Eric Holder back in 2009, thinking that I was there just on a short-term basis to help out after the inauguration. I was able to go in just 8 days after he was sworn in, so this can be very fast. Meanwhile, the senior appointees will be working their way through the Presidential Personnel Office, which, by the way, I have never seen one of those work efficiently in any administration, whether Democratic or Republican. And they also have to go through financial disclosure forms, which are quite punishing. I know Ron is aware of that. And security clearances. Now, one note here, the Trump team has said that it's going to streamline the process for senior appointees, which in general I would applaud, but they want to eliminate the FBI security clearance requirement. They may, I've heard some talk that they're going to turn perhaps to an outside private vendor to do that, because the FBI does take a tremendously long time, though they are very, very thorough. But one of my predictions is that the further down the chain on political appointments that they go, where these are not people that Trump and his team around him know personally, that they're going to want to have information in depth about these people before they're listed as the president's appointments. A second note here, in Trump's first term, the White House never sought confirmations for any of his several appointees of OJP acting assistant attorneys general. And in other contexts, President Trump announced that he liked to have acting appointees. I assume because they have less power and they would be much less likely to challenge him. We'll need to see if a similar pattern prevails this time, but it's clear that it weakens the agency and really undercuts that appointee's ability to carry out, in this case, the president's desires and work. It also, just on a day-to-day basis, really weakens the agency in its strength in dealing with other parts of the Justice Department. It weakens the agency and that leader on Capitol Hill and in their dealings with the field. So I want to talk for a minute about career staff at OJP, and this would be true for a lot of people broadly in the Justice Department. For them, everything will largely be on hold until new senior political leadership beyond the handler come in. But a very big concern, which Trump brings for DOJ career staff, I'm sure you're aware of this, are his stated plans to implement the new Schedule F for the civil service regulations, and some reports of broadly firing people in the Justice Department, though I think that's a little hard in some ways to easily achieve. But in brief summary, with Schedule F, it would remove civil service protections from many current federal employees, potentially up to tens or hundreds of thousands across the civil service. And because it's based on broad and innocuous statutory language that currently exists, it would not need congressional approval to be implemented. You probably are aware of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, laying out kind of a series of kind of a blueprint for action by the administration coming in. Now, Trump has said this is not his document, but dozens and dozens, if not more than that, of his former staff prepared this document. And it states that the goal of Schedule F is, quote, to bend and break the bureaucracy to the presidential will, close quote. And how this meshes with different parts of the government, for example, science agencies, is unclear. Turning to other pronouncements in Project 2025, one of its headings calls for protecting the integrity of BJS and NIJ. So that sounds really promising. However, when you read the text below, some of the language is concerning. It says the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics should focus on producing the statistics of greatest interest to everyday Americans and hence of policymakers, rather than those of particular interest to criminal justice academics. BJS should not pursue the niche political agendas of academics or advocates. And similar language is included for NIJ. On a different note, the document strongly supports adequate and continued funding for the National Crime Victimization Survey, which differs from language in many other parts of the overall report about cutting federal budgets. Though I would note that in our area that I'm talking about, OJP, BJS, NIJ, et cetera, there is no discussion of budget cuts. Now, turning to other relevant proclamations in Project 2025, it says that, quote, DOJ grants are an underutilized asset in most conservative administrations. When used properly, they can be highly effective in implementing the president's priorities. Now, having run the agency, I do think that's not an unreasonable statement. And but it specifically calls for conducting, it specifically calls for conducting an immediate, comprehensive review of all federal grant dispersals to ensure program areas are being properly run and so on. And at the same time, it calls for a new and more rigorous vetting of grant applicants to ensure baseline fitness and eligibility for the grant dollars. And then this is the kind of interesting language. So they are going only to lawful actors who support federal law enforcement and demonstrate the ability and willingness to engage in lawful activities. Now that would be kind of new and unusual language requirements for NIJ research applicants. What about funding levels for these DOJ agencies? As I said, we don't have direct information about that, whether there would be cuts. We don't have any clear read where Trump's cuts would come from, other than some indication that he's interested in cutting BOP's budget. But I'm sure there will be areas in OJP's portfolio, for example, grants established by Congress dealing with indigent defense, that would not be a priority for the incoming administration. But my guess is that appropriation levels overall for OJP programs won't change, will not change radically, at least not immediately. And I would include that for NIJ and BJS. In some areas, for example, on funding for law enforcement, such as the JAG-BURN program, I anticipate the administration might well call for some increased funding. And not surprisingly, in any change of administration from Democratic to Republican or vice versa, some initiatives, for example, Biden's Community Violence Intervention CVI program, will obviously come to an end. So clearly there's much more we could address here, but I think my time is probably up, and let me turn it back at this point to Ted Guest. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going ahead with Ron Davis, Director of the U.S. Marshal Service.
I'll start up here.
Okay.
Got it? Good afternoon, everyone. I'll say good early evening, huh? Thank you. I appreciate that. One person say good afternoon. Yeah. So I'm going to address some of the issues from a different perspective. As was mentioned, I'm currently the Director of the United States Marshal Service. And before I had this appointment, like Lori, I also served in the Obama administration as Director of the COPS Office. And so I've had the ability to transition now. This will be 2 times transitioning from the Obama administration to the first Trump administration, and now from the Biden-Harris administration to the Trump-Vance administration. And like Lori, also served on the transition team for Biden-Harris coming in. And so serving on the agency review team, you do see the impact what transition has. But I'm going to come in from the perspective of the election is over. And so now, how does law enforcement respond? So we got the federal agency, but as mentioned, I spent 30 years also in local. I spent 20 years in Oakland Police Department, Lori was alluding to, and I spent close to 9 years as the police chief in East Palo Alto. And so now that I enter and I add all this up, this comes up in my 39th year in public service, is what does transition mean for law enforcement? How do we respond to it? And I agreed to come, besides not being able to say no to Lori, and anybody that knows Lori, you can't say no, even if you wanted to say no. But in addition to not being able to say no, I thought and looked at the association in which you represent as far as research, and to me that equals evidence and data, that you are very significant in law enforcement, and not just on a day-to-day basis, but even during transition, because transition, in my opinion, is something that provides an opportunity, regardless of what one feels about the outcome. And as I sit here as a director of the law, as a director of a law enforcement agency, I have to look in the lens of any election, right? You're looking at 50% of the people primarily are going to be happy, and an equal amount, give or take a few thousand votes, are not. And so law enforcement cannot bend back and forth based on that perspective. It has to be now the things, those core values that drive us, so that the question has to be, and the question that my career deputies must ask now, the questions that the leaders who are going to be there past a transitional period must ask now is, how do you then serve the next commander-in-chief to accomplish his or her goals in the most effective, the most ethical, and the most efficient manner? And I think what I drive to during a transition is for law enforcement to maintain that integrity and remember who they take an oath to. You take an oath to the Constitution, but it also goes to when you start identifying how to help someone achieve that transition. I think the key to that is how to do it in those 3 E's that we talked about. How to do it effectively, in my opinion, requires that you do it based on evidence and that you use data and that you're responding, because all of us have a very finite amount of resources. So to be able to focus that, to be able to point that, to be effective without compromising the core values is very important. And I think what goes to that is the evidence and the data. When I think back when I became a cop in beautiful Oakland, wow, unfortunately I have to say this, in 1985, some time ago, and I look at where we have advanced since then, it'd be fair to say not only we have advanced with our technology, we've advanced with our understanding about crime and the causes of crime. I think the biggest advance has been that we have convinced a generation of law enforcement leaders, and I'd like to think I was one of those that have evolved over these 39 years that started understanding the value of research, the value of evidence, and developing strategies based on that evidence and not based on what we did last year, based on anecdotes, based on what makes people feel good from a temporary point of view. In other words, you can appease community with a lot of action, but I always say it's like a car that's spinning donuts in the middle of the street. It's a lot of noise, it's a lot of smoke, but you're not going anywhere, and you end up damaging your car. And so without proper evidence and research, we end up damaging the car. And in many cases, that beautiful car represents the community because it has the collateral impacts on the community. So as we look at a transition period, I look at just the Marshal Service. We're probably the most unique law enforcement agency to talk about transition because we are the oldest federal law enforcement agency in the United States. So we were formed under the Judiciary Act of 1789, so that makes us 235 years old. And if you think back, the act was signed by the first president of the United States, President George Washington, signed the Judicial Act that created the judiciary and created the U.S. Marshals. So if I were good, I had the math. That means we now have gone through the Marshal Service 47 transitions. And so because of that, I guess it would actually more if you look at even a second term president maintains his or her, in this case, his number, there's still a transition. We said, Lord, even at the second term. So it's more than that. But all those transitions, I think the agency has learned that in order to maintain our apolitical posture, and I think what you want from your federal law enforcement agencies is exactly that, is to be apolitical. Now, the Marshals are unique because in addition to me being a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed position, so are my 94 marshals. Each judicial district has a U.S. Marshal appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And what is interesting to me is when we embrace transition as an opportunity, when we embrace transition as a moment to pause and take a look at where we're at, as we look at transition as a period to say, hold it. We want to go in this direction. How do we get there? How do we get to where we're at today? What are the lessons learned? What do we need to accomplish that? And if asked by an agency review team, how do you help the new administration achieve that goal in that very effective and very ethical and very efficient way? But as you're going through this, I think it's very critical that we still have that discussion and identify how do we get to where we're going. So a transition provides a lot of opportunities, and time and time again, what I've seen with my agency, I have marshals that were appointed by President Bush. I have marshals that are appointed by, right now, among the 94 marshals, not all of them are confirmed, we have some vacancies, but under the ones that I do have that are Senate confirmed, we have appointees from President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, first term, President Biden, and soon to be President Trump again. And what it says when law enforcement focuses on issues that you focus on understanding violent crime, and understanding how to be responsive to the needs of our community, understanding that our core values do not bend with transition, they don't bend with an administration, that the rule of law remains the rule of law, that the Constitution is the Constitution. When we stick to that, we can see through the Marshal Service that people that are appointed by one president continue to serve, administration after administration, because they're serving in their district, they're serving with our state and local partners, and they're serving as one. One of the other things I'll say, and I won't spend a lot of time, but I do want to hear your questions, is transition is also a time to remind us the uniqueness of the American policing system, right? So recently, I did some travel abroad, and I said I wasn't going to name the place, but I am going to name it. I recently came back from Colombia. We have a foreign field office there, as we do a lot of extraditions. And they have a couple of law enforcement agencies, but it's a reminder that because we're so decentralized, and there's a debate whether it's 15,000 to 18,000 law enforcement agencies, rarely does a single election impact law enforcement, right? Most of the law enforcement, that 16,000, is going to be at the state and local level. So that could be elections from city councils to mayors to state legislators to gubernatorial candidates to the President of the United States to congressional delegations to the senator. Usually it's not one. And so what drives over the last 39 years for me, law enforcement, would be those things that we keep advancing and moving forward and taking advantage of transitional periods. Whether or not we're the 50% that's happy with the election or whether we're the 50% that is not. We have the opportunity to move forward. And the fact that I still have marshals that are contributing from multiple administration leaves me optimistic. And so as I transition this outstanding agency, I am very excited for the opportunity they can have. But they're going to need you to be able to make sure that we have the evidence necessary to make the argument. When asked, how do we achieve this? If immigration is the policy, how do we achieve it? If reducing violent crime is, how do we achieve it? And how do we do so? Using evidence and data. And I think the work that you have done over the past 30 years has made a difference and will continue to make a difference. And so I would ask, as we're talking about transitions, as we're talking about elections, that we do so in the sense of trying to understand and understand the agenda. And I know Lori read a couple of documents that at this stage I would tell my staff and my team is a campaign document of yesterday. Once the election is over, is now probably could be a governing document. Understand it and start asking the questions. What does it mean for this agency? What does it mean for the federal government? What does it mean for the communities that we serve? What does it mean for the American people? And what role do we play? And I would say this, after 39 years, as I now wind my career to an end and get ready for that next chapter, as they say, I look back and I do want to say as I close to thank you for what you bring to the table. Thank you for the research and thank you for the idea of better understanding. We are probably better crime fighters as a federal government, as a local and state governments, even based on transition after transition, because we are learning more and more about what drives crime, how we improve public safety, how we should invest the finite resources of our government from the taxpayer, how we hold people accountable, what does it mean to reform and do so in a manner that does not make it kind of counterproductive. And so I think there was a comment made about, was this an election about crime? And I would just say, and I think the Marshal Service history of 235 years and over 47 transitions, every election is about crime because the American people deserve to be safe. They deserve to have places where they can enjoy and really live out the American dream. So any election or any process or any transition that is not focusing at least on how to make people safe, I think is probably not going to be a very good one. And I think now it may vary. Some may focus on one way, the direction may go a different way. And I think more and more, the more evidence you recover, the more you show, the more we measure what works, the more likely people are to follow. I think people want results. They want actual results that are measurable. People want results that can be replicated. People want results that can stand the credibility, the academic rigor of whether or not this worked, if we're going to drop hundreds of millions and billions of dollars into it. And so for those who, depending on what scale you're on right now, if you're happy or if you're sad, I would say take hold of the fact that we have transitioned for generations. We have transitioned, we have advanced, we have learned, but I will leave you with this. There is so much work to be done. And so for a new generation of researchers, a new generation of law enforcement, for those who have been here for a while, all I would say right now is a lot of work needs to be done. I think we are all up to it, and I am very optimistic about our future, never pessimistic, because you can't do that if you're sitting in the chair that I'm sitting. It must always be moving forward. It must always be that, because I owe that to my deputies and I owe that to my admin professionals. if they're willing, and unfortunately some have done this, to put their lives on the line to serve the American people, then what they deserve from me is nothing but a heartfelt support, smile, and optimism about their future and building a structure that makes sure they can serve and continue to serve, and that transitions are a moment of opportunity, not a moment to go backwards, not a moment to be disappointed, not a moment to do anything other than continuing their service to the American people. That's what you pay for. That's what they've committed their lives to, and I just want to leave you with that's what they're going to do, at least for the thousands of men and women that I have the honor of working with and leading every day. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Now we're going to go to Mark Levin of the Council on Criminal Justice.
Well, thank you for being here, especially during happy hour. You know, in the last legislative session in Texas, we got something through that said a portion of the mixed beverage sales tax goes to problem-solving court. So when you come to Texas, have a drink. It's going to go to a good cause. But it really is good to be here, and I want to align myself with what's already been said. Lori Robinson actually covered some of the points I was, including the impact of disorder on people's perception of crime. As we know, Ernesto's here. We do a lot of data at the Council on Criminal Justice, and some of you may have seen the major cities police chiefs data that just came out, which again shows the sharp decline in crime in the last few years. But obviously, when you look at things that aren't index crimes, which is where the quality of life stuff shows up, the public urination, the trespassing, property crimes that don't meet the felony threshold, and so forth, is where you really see the public becoming frustrated. And of course, in terms of the election, the only explanation that got any coverage at all for disorder was migrants. There wasn't a counter explanation, and as we know, there's a whole lot of causes which can involve everything from high housing costs to people that force people to sleep on the streets. A third of homeless people in California have a job, by the way, but also mental illness, substance use disorder, and it isn't that new. I mean, there's been people on the street in the Tenderloin, which I just saw today, for decades, and the solutions are complicated, and so are the causes, as we know. But I want to kind of focus on some positive things, especially the legacy of the First Step Act. Some of you may have been involved as well in that. I remember the first time I went to the White House and met with Jared Kushner, and he basically said, I'm going to tell my father-in-law this is great policy. I'm also going to tell him that this will increase his share of the black vote, and also that this is something President Obama couldn't do. And lo and behold, he said there would be a 70 or 80% chance, and to his credit, President Trump embraced it, and he pressured Mitch McConnell, who didn't want to do it, to put it on the floor because it divided the Republican caucus, but ended up getting over 80 votes. Actually, one of the announcements that just came, Doug Collins is going to be Veterans Secretary. He was a big champion of the First Step Act as well. So we do try to look at the positive aspects, and I think we also have to look at the tensions. And obviously, there's been a lot of law and order rhetoric. I mean, you'll remember the comment about having one day where I guess we just punish everyone in the most severe way possible, which obviously isn't drawn from any academic research. But on the other hand, you have this kind of outlaw or rebel mentality bucking the system. And some of you may have seen that Trump actually carried the Cook County Jail, which was the only precinct he carried in that area, about 1,200 votes there. But in the history of America, you've had Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, this fascination and attraction to kind of outlaw figures. I think of the phrase "don't tread on me," which is a pretty popular one in parts of Texas where I am. But that does point to areas like civil asset forfeiture. A few weeks before the election, President Trump said he wanted to legalize marijuana. And then you did see kind of the biggest shift was 18 to 29-year-old men, which obviously includes many black and Latino men. And so he comes in with, of course, that coalition behind him that's much broader and different than 2016. And so I do think, going back to, say, stop and frisk, and I'll get into a second why the federal government doesn't have the power to order local police forces to do that. But that's not something that I think necessarily everyone that voted for him was kind of bargaining for. And then I think there's some really positive things that have great appeal across the spectrum. Think about when you look at the map, the political map of this country, the rural areas, and there where you have access to justice really being under pressure in terms of you can have hundreds of miles to have to travel for the nearest mental health clinic, indigent defense, substance abuse treatment. These things very difficult to access. So again, there's ways to emphasize how there's a broad constituency for these priorities. I do want to talk a little bit about federalism, and I think you kind of referenced that, Ron, with 18,000 police departments. That is a really valuable thing we have, and also the fact that the Supreme Court in recent years has, this really comes from a conservative legal philosophy, limited what agencies can do without authorization from Congress. And so, of course, you have things like the Administrative Procedures Act that you can't skip steps on that. That was essentially when the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that President Trump and his first administration couldn't reverse DACA because they didn't go through all the steps of the Administrative Procedures Act. You also have the delegation doctrine, and I would point you to a case in 2018, City of Chicago versus Sessions out of the Seventh Circuit. And what this dealt with was there was an effort to make COPS grants conditional on cities or other jurisdictions adopting or repealing sanctuary city policies. And it was a 3-0 decision by a Seventh Circuit panel of all Republican appointees that said that is commandeering, that it's not something that the executive branch cannot unilaterally add conditions that are not specified by Congress and statute. Now, there's another body of law going back to a case about 30 or 40 years ago that says Congress can put conditions despite the 10th Amendment and federalism, but those have to be related to the grants. So there's quite a bit of solid precedent there that I think we need to keep in mind. And I know it was popular to say there are no guardrails before the election, but we do have the Constitution. We do have this line of decisions, which I think, obviously many people on the left did not like some of these decisions limiting what the administrative state can do in contexts like the environment, but it certainly applies across the board no matter who's president. I want to also talk about, turning to research as I close my comments, and I think what all of you do as criminologists is incredibly important. And I would also, as much as we're talking about BJA and NIJ, as important as they are, think about the role of other agencies in funding research and what other solutions can come from that. So the reason I kind of mention that is we know there's lots of things that can be done outside the criminal justice system that can prevent crime. You can think about early childhood development. You can think about lead paint research. I know Jennifer Doliak, I don't know if she's here, she's elevated that. But I mean, it don't have to be on the right or the left to say we don't want, lead in our pipes. And street lighting, clearing out dilapidated, abandoned buildings that can become stash houses for gangs. These are all things that are done by agencies outside of the criminal justice system, whether it's public works or health and human services, education. These can have an important role in preventing crime. And something like housing costs that I mentioned earlier, you have a big movement now, yes, in my backyard, YIMBY, that's really bridging the ideological divide. So I would say one thing we've seen since I got involved in this area back in 2005 is, y'all can remember the Tea Party. There was this incredible aversion to government spending on the right, and I think there's some value to that. But what I've seen change really is a greater interest in what can be done for stronger families. And obviously you saw some of that with both campaigns emphasizing the child tax credit and how to get people, encourage people to have more children. I think if you look at the data, efforts in other countries like France have had a limited impact in that. But nonetheless, it's something that has some appeal. And I think as we think about the role of research, we do need to think outside of the criminal justice system in addition to what happens when somebody's in the system. And then I'll just conclude by saying I'm a big fan, if you haven't seen it, of the Vital City Symposium on the role of academic research, and it was in response to an article by Megan Stevenson that many of you may have seen, and it caused me to write a piece that serendipitously turned out to, then I found out they were doing that issue. And the bottom line from my perspective is that the arc of history does bend towards research, but it's a very uneven line. And I would say it's in addition to like finding things that do work, as important as that is, it's important to identify things that don't work. So I think about DARE and Scared Straight. Now, when the research kind of built showing those programs didn't work and were even counterproductive, they didn't just go away the next day, but over time, they actually kind of did dissipate. So it does break through, but it can take years, and it goes through many different stages. And there's a lot of folks involved, I think, in helping to translate that research into public policy. And of course, finally, you don't always need a bill to implement those things that do work. I think about how probation departments have changed over decades, how many are doing CBT, how we've moved towards medication-assisted treatment in many instances for opioid disorder. And finally, on the CVI thing, I hope I'm a little more optimistic than you, Lori, that the incoming administration will look at the research. I mean, Thomas, you put out a really good report the other day that looked at the 18 studies on CVI, and obviously it's a burgeoning literature. It's not fully developed, and you pointed out some of the ones that work the best have the closest linkage to police agencies, so it should not be seen as an anti-police, but a complementary approach. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but check back with me later, and thanks for all the research you do.
Thank you, Mark. Now, our final speaker will be Marissa Lagos of KQED here in San Francisco. And I'll give a plug, maybe she won't, but just today, excuse me, just today she had a story which she may allude to today about what she views as the meaning of these California votes last week related to crime.
Thanks, Ted. Marissa Lagos. I've covered California politics for about 20 years, and I got into the criminal justice space during some of the early debates, well, I don't know how familiar everyone here is with the criminal justice system here in California, but pre-realignment in 2011, which was really kind of the first attempt to start lowering our prison and jail populations outside of that Supreme Court order that told California to do that, or they would do it for us. So I really do try to come at my reporting from a very data and scientific perspective. I do a lot of conversations with folks like yourselves to talk about kind of what we actually know, because so much of crime and criminal justice coverage and sort of the way it lives in the public space, I think, is based a lot on emotion, not on data. And I think you see this to a large extent with this election. So I'll kind of talk about what Ted was alluding to, which was my reporting coming out of last week's election, looking at, in particular, the passage of Proposition 36, which rolled back some earlier criminal justice reforms, and then the recall of the district attorney out in Alameda County, and the defeat of the incumbent DA in Los Angeles County, George Gascon. I think a lot of people have looked at this nationally and sort of made the assumption that this is a full repudiation of criminal justice reform, that California, had gone too far too fast, and that voters are over it. I think that's partly true. I think we did go really far, really fast. But the people who wrote Prop 36, which was prosecutors, when I talk to them, they are not using the language that they used, say, 15 years ago to talk about these issues. And the measure they wrote was not what voters rejected in 2020, was not similar to previous language that had been put out. And why that's important is that they really focus their message around treatment, the need to sort of tackle things like drug use and housing and homelessness, and then tying these all back to some of the really visible issues we see around property crime and fentanyl use and kind of the disorder we're seeing on our streets. So just quickly, Prop 36 rolled back portions of Prop 47 that was passed in 2014. If you know California, you know we love our ballot measures here. Prop 47 essentially took low-level thefts and drug possession and moved them from felonies down to misdemeanors. The idea being that, in the backer's mind, that if you are going to be spending money locking people up, they should be for violent crimes, and that people who are, shoplifting or drug addicted should really be offered treatment instead. And Prop 47 took the savings from having fewer people in prisons and jails and put it back into rehabilitation and reentry. And the data showed that's really worked. The recidivism rates on the folks who have participated in those programs have been overwhelmingly successful, in the single digits compared to what was, I think, a 66% recidivism rate when we went into that Supreme Court order in the late 2000s. But we all know what's happened outside on the streets and the sort of growing frustration at going into your CVS or your Walgreens or your Target and having everything locked up. And so I think from a political perspective, one of the things I've observed is that the folks who backed this Proposition 47 did not respond to what they were hearing from their constituents and from the public. And I think it kind of reached a head after COVID and kind of some of the crime patterns that we saw shifting during that time. So Prop 36 was written by prosecutors. It was essentially says that if somebody is arrested on a third theft charge or a third drug use charge, they can be charged with a felony. In the case of somebody who's being charged with drug possession, it does give prosecutors the option to offer them treatment and divert out of that felony charge. And so voters passed this by 70% overwhelmingly in every county in the state, even the most liberal ones. It crossed pretty much all demographic lines. And so clearly that is some sort of repudiation of the status quo. But when I talked to the DA who championed this most vocally, who was the head of the campaign out in Yolo County this week, he essentially said, look, we don't want to go back to the 90s. We think that there's been a lot of progress made and the pendulum kind of swung too far. So we're bringing it back to the center. And so I think that is really indicative of kind of where this election is at in California. I would argue similarly with the district attorney races, where these incumbents lost their seats. They were seen as progressive DAs. In Los Angeles in particular, George Gascon came in and on day one issued a lot of edicts that were sort of the mirror image of what his tough on crime predecessors had done. Instead of saying we're going to charge every sentencing enhancement, he said we're not going to charge any of them. And I think he ran into a lot of problems both practically, on a policy perspective, and politically. I don't think he listened to what his constituents were saying. I don't think he responded. I don't think he built goodwill in his office. It's a huge office of thousands of attorneys spread across all of LA County, which is larger than I think some states. And I think similarly in Alameda, Pamela Price was not necessarily responsive to the political realities on the ground. In both cases, they did what they promised. I mean, they campaigned on these progressive platforms, and they came in and did exactly what they said they were gonna do. But we've seen how quickly the kind of pendulum changed from 2020 during the racial justice protests till now. And I think that in some ways, like when you take all of those together, it really speaks to an electorate that is dissatisfied with the status quo, that is frustrated with the lack of progress with what's happening. And that is one of the people I talked to in my story point out, like you can't talk people out of their emotional responses to crime and what they see with their own eyes. So I think that, what's interesting to me is I've done very deep dives looking at what the outcome, like what the impacts of something like Proposition 47 was. And I think that when you look at the data, there was not an increase in shoplifting until around the pandemic. There was actually a really funny campaign ad that had a graph showing a flat line of shoplifting and then a huge spike since 2020. And they said Prop 47, has increased shoplifting. Well, Prop 47 passed in 2014. It was like, I think from your guys' standpoint, it would have been malpractice to put out a graph like that and make that sort of claim. But it spoke to what people were emotionally feeling, right? The other thing that's really come out of a lot of my conversations with criminologists and others about this issue is how important policing is, actually more so than criminal penalties. And I do think that one of the things we've seen politically in the past few years is a real frustration on the part of police departments and police officers about both some of the policies that were passed, like some of these reforms, and just the political climate, again, coming out of 2020 and a lot of those protests and, calls to defund the police, things like that. We saw really pulling back of a lot of these city police departments. And I do think that that impacted both the data, because it is true that some stores, some folks are not reporting these lower level crimes, but it's also true that what I've been taught year after year from talking to criminologists and others, is that swift and certain sanctions are actually way more useful than criminal penalties. And so having police actually respond to these things and be visible is really important. We saw the new LAPD chief in LA today talk about that and say that he thinks people aren't reporting crimes and he wants them to call the police more. I think the police are going to have to play a role in like building back some of that trust with folks. But I also think that, you know, part of the challenge has been the staffing crisis in our police departments. And you kind of mix all that together, it becomes really difficult, I think, to make the argument, you know, if you're a police officer and you're getting a call for a violent crime or for somebody shoplifting, you're clearly going to respond to the violent crime. And so I think that's kind of an open question for a lot of the law enforcement who backed this measure, is like, how do they implement it with no new funding and with the real challenge that we're seeing in terms of recruiting new police officers? I can stop there because I know we have questions, but I'll just kind of end by saying, like, I think often in politics, you know, we do see pendulums swing, but often they're not kind of as extreme as we read them as in the moment. And so I'm really interested to see here in California, how do these new elected officials, the new DA in Los Angeles, Nathan Hochman, who did not run a, you know, sort of traditional 1990s tough on crime campaign. He really ran opposing George Gascon and what he had done, how he had comported himself. The folks who back Prop 36 are DAs and probation and other people who now have the responsibility to implement it. And so I think that, you know, that's sort of, the ball is in their court, and I think it's going to be fascinating to see how they handle that, and then how this legislature, this governor who really opposed Prop 36 and some of these changes going, you know, rolling back reforms, if they're willing to kind of put the money into what law enforcement is going to come to them and ask for now that we have some of these harsher laws on the books. Thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists. We have a few minutes available for Q&A here, so as I said earlier, anyone who has a question or comment, please come up to the microphone here, and you can address questions to specific panelists or just to the panel generally. So who wants to start?
Hello, can you hear me? So I have a question going back to Prop 2025 and what it means for research. So I didn't think I would have to read it, but there I was at 4 a.m. the night of the election going through all of Prop 2025. And it seems like as we read between the lines, the very thin lines, it kind of, there's some preferences in what is supported in research or what should not be focused on in national research. So what do you all on the panel feel that this may mean for the direction of research, because the work that is done by criminologists then translate to the data that is available for all of practitioners? Do you feel that some of that brand recognition that may be lost will impact criminology differently over the next 4 years? And if so, what does that mean for translational criminology? What does that mean for how we can impact actual policy-making decisions with the research that we contribute?
Anyone want to handle that? Go ahead.
Well, that's a very, very good question. I'm going to start this off, but I think my colleagues here will want to jump in as well. But I think so much of this is going to depend on who ends up being appointed the director of NIJ, because, and a second factor here will be whether and to what extent Congress, through the appropriations committees and subcommittees, actually direct NIJ to undertake research in particular areas, which is not unknown. There certainly have been things that have been directed to the agency to undertake. But I think I can think of very few instances where direction, maybe can't think of any instances where direction came from the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General or the Associate as far as what NIJ should be doing. So it really will come down to a large extent to the director, him or herself. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it gives you a sense that we may not know right away because we won't necessarily know who the person is, and then won't know what he or she is going to do until they're actually on board.
That's fair. That's very fair. Yeah.
Anyone else want to comment on that? No?
Mark?
I agree with you. I mean, but I do think there's this tension, right, between skepticism of research and of science, which obviously we saw quite a bit during the pandemic, more broadly. And a degree of skepticism is always healthy, and it's like the same with the criminal justice system, but you also need the currency of trust to have the criminal justice system work. So people report crimes, people serve as witnesses, and so striking that balance is the key.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the audience? I don't think we've covered every possible crime question, so yes, go ahead.
We have come actually to ask your opinion. It's not really a question. I used to be a police officer in India, and I'm now a professor at Indiana University. I have a lot of experience of seeing or observing how criminal justice agencies can be controlled, manipulated, and used for specific policy objectives. And the concern that I'm raising is that I just need your opinion. Do you think the criminal justice agencies in this country, in this given circumstances, are going to be able to promote and stick with the rule of law, or they are going to be following orders? And let's say a couple of specific instances. For example, the incoming president has said that he's going to be very strict about deporting people. So are they just going to deport people, or are they going to follow the law in every case? Are they going to be, he wants to be very vindictive about, again, has already named certain people. So are the agencies going to be sort of following orders and then trying to file cases or pursue any of the complaints that have been made? Or again, they're going to be following the due process. And finally, of course, his own cases, are they going to be again in accordance with the law, or do you think they will simply be washed away? Thank you.
Well, I think actually this relates in part to what Lori was talking about earlier about the civil service. And Project 2025 is 900 pages, and I did read some of it. You know, there's some language in there about, you know, strengthening the performance review process for civil service personnel, which may be quite reasonable. But what Lori was referring to was, of course, reclassifying thousands of potential federal workers as political appointees instead of civil service. And that's where I think about Tammany Hall, if you remember that book about, I think it was about the Boston machine, but there were machines in Chicago and New York. But basically, you know, if you didn't support the right party in city elections, your trash didn't get picked up. If you needed someone, needed something done, it was all about who you knew. And of course, we see examples of that today when people are indicted for corruption, public officials. But you know, I think that the idea of civil service is that you have decisions, whether it's made about an environmental permit to issue or something in the context we're talking about today, that the decision is made on the merits, not on who the applicant supported politically, and that sort of thing. And so I do worry a great deal about how this could affect the rule of law.
I think everyone should take the president-elect at his word. He has been very clear about what his plans are. We can sit here and say, oh, we don't know, but he has said what he wants to do. And a lot of that is to use the DOJ to go after political enemies. It is to, you know, defund programs and policies he does not believe should be there. And I don't see any reason not to take him at his word.
If I may add one thing, I guess if I heard the question, I'm going to maybe separate. There was a question, one would be a political preference, which some people are talking about, so I won't respond to that. But I think the question would police officers still follow the rule of law? And I think for me, and not to be naive, I think a lot of things that people may be concerned about or what they may debate doesn't come in the category of the rule of law. It comes in the category of the discretion that any president wins an election has. That's why they say elections matter. But when it comes to the rule of law, I have faith that our system, because it is so decentralized and it's not just one entity that covers it, that police officers have to go follow the rule of law, otherwise they're subject to criminal prosecutions as well, locally, at the state level, and also civil liability. So I think the professionals that we are hiring, and that's where it comes down to those 16,000 agencies, will follow the rule of law. And I think the idea that they could get an order, and our history tells us, we have learned through tragedies, we have learned through all kinds of history, that following an unlawful is never an excuse. You can't say because I was ordered to do so. We've learned that from wars with the issues of war crimes and going back to even further than that. So I guess I'm going to take a little bit more optimistic that I think they will follow the rule of law. The question moving forward for any society as it moves forward is, what does that look like? What are within the discretion of the rule of law? What are the priorities of administration? Where do they want to go with it? And what will they focus on? Even within immigration, you could have a debate about what is and what is not, and that would then go to the courts, which is also separate. So I would say, I think to focus on, this is about as far as I'm going to get to politics. I'm very careful with this. To put everything on one person or one administration may be missing a larger challenge that we've had for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And that is taking a look at defining the rule of law, what role we play, what does it mean, and how we serve the American people. So I still maintain that optimism, because I have faith that the individuals who take the oath will embrace that oath, regardless who's the commander-in-chief, regardless who the mayor is, regardless who the governor is, that they're not going to go out and violate the law just because someone said it's okay to do so. That doesn't mean that people are not going to do it. Doesn't mean that messages are not embraced and people will follow that. I'm just suggesting overall, I have faith that they will be consistent with the rule of law.
Can I just say, I agree. I think the vast majority, as we see every day, of police will follow the law. But I do think that there is legitimate concern about whether, a DOJ under the next administration will even undertake pattern and practice and other civil rights investigations. Trump talked very explicitly on the campaign trail about giving full immunity to police. I don't know exactly what that means, but these are, again, things that he has said very clearly, and it was part of how he got elected. So they're not, it's not out of the realm of possibility that we will not see the same accountability when police officers or police agencies do step outside of the rule of law. Because that has been the role of the federal government for really the last ever. So, I think that's something to definitely be watching.
Yes. Next question.
Thanks to each of you for being a part of this presidential panel. My hope is that, and I appreciate, Director Davis, your identification that across various administrations, individuals have hung in there and served in the Marshal Service. I should hope that there's going to be a strong voice of the American Society of Criminology to say to those faithful civil servants that have hung in at those various departments of justice that they hang in there, because as we discuss the trying to create a more perfect union and a more just society, we need every soul to hang in there and to do the good work. And I think that the academy that's represented by the American Society of Criminology can be a powerful voice to encourage those to hang in there and not throw up their hands and leave important, valuable positions that will contribute to our becoming a more just society. So I thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments on that, or?
Well, there's strength in numbers, right? I mean, obviously, if you're asked to do something illegal or immoral, you can resign, and if thousands of people or hundreds of people, there's the threat of that does deter, and obviously that had an impact in terms of the Attorney General not being replaced in the closing days of the first Trump administration, the threat of many people resigning at DOJ. So there's strength in numbers in those kinds of principled stands to say that if you're asked to do something illegal or immoral, that you'll resign, and many other people might do the same. And obviously, like in Watergate, they kept getting, I guess, new attorney generals. But ultimately, there's, as you said, standards, whether it's the legal profession, there are clear standards that we have to, as a licensed attorney, that we have to adhere to, in addition to following the law.
Can I give you guys an example of why I think research is important? I would say 10 years ago, and Lori may remember this, for federal law enforcement, and if you were involved in any of our task forces, you were prohibited from wearing a body-worn camera to participate. Now, the power of numbers comes down to as agencies, as state and local agencies started using evidence, started engaging with the community, they saw the value of the transparency in building the trust and legitimacy in the community. It took those agencies to come back, and this was actually during the first Trump administration with Attorney General Barr, that says, we're at the point now that if I can't wear my camera because this is what I've committed to my community as a local police chief, then you can't have my officers to serve in your task force. We are now, except in the Marshal Service, 70% of my deputies have now been issued, and we're going to try to get to 100% because of this pushback from the community and the pushback from the local law enforcement. So what I'm getting to is not to be naive about it or to minimize the role the federal government plays, but the federal government is also influenced by state and local. It's not just a one-sided lever. And in fact, the key to the Marshal Service, for example, is I have 4,000 deputies, 1,700 administrative personnel, but the work that we do does not occur unless I also include the close to 5,000 task force officers that come from local and state law enforcement. And if I'm not engaging into the activity that they can explain to their local community, their local council, their local mayor, who have been educated through the research being done, then I don't have 5,000 task force officers and we can't accomplish the mission. So I think to this idea of kind of hang in there, I think it's more than that. It is to speak up, it is to be very loud, it is to identify what works, what doesn't work, and do not dismiss the impact of a lot of the groups that you're working with. The associations that represent law enforcement too, that have been sitting at the table for the, as Lori knows, from the last 20 or 30 years, that are also outlining the ways to get to where you need to go. If that's your goal, I got you, but this is not the way. And more importantly, you may lose 15,000 police departments, 3,200 sheriff's offices, if you don't do it in a way that's consistent to the people that I get elected by if I'm a sheriff, or my mayor gets elected by if I'm a local police chief. So there's a lot of, that's what I'm saying, I don't put it all at one time. I've been for 30, 40 years, we've had this discussion, it's cyclical, it comes and goes, and without sounding really bad, the profession is bigger than any individual moment. The communities are bigger than that, and so we basically have to keep pushing forward with that, but I think to your point, you just can't ignore the impact because it does matter. That's why they say elections matter. It does matter the role the federal government play, but it's not, I don't think it's an isolated decision. I think state and locals, I think your association and many others can contribute greatly to the focus of any administration.
Great note. It's a great note to end on.
Yes, we've expired, our time has expired. Thank you all for the panelists and thank you all for coming. I think we covered a lot of ground here and people seem to be optimistic about things as they will evolve. We'll all have to be watching it. Thank you all.
Very well said.
Oh, thank you.